is Azim Azar, and I'm the founder, the person behind Exponential View, which is a newsletter that covers our changing world. And I'm really excited to have our first live event today, COVID-19, the state of the world and what happens next, with a very special guest, Gideon Litchfield, the editor-in-chief of the MIT Tech Review. Gideon, say hello now before I jump on for a couple of minutes of administration.
Hello, Azim. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here.
It is great to have you here as well. So let's just talk a little bit about what we're going to do today. Gideon and I are going to chat for between 45 minutes and an hour, maybe a bit longer, about what happens to the world after this horrible pandemic is dealt with, how we might go about dealing with it, and what comes next. Please do say hello in the chat panel. If you're watching this on Crowdcast, you can also put questions in, and we will do our best to answer some of them. And if you are new to Exponential View, you can find a green button that is on your Crowdcast display that lets you join the system with a 10% discount forever. And actually, as it happens, for the month of April, 35% of all of our new revenues are going to go to various coronavirus causes, the National Health Service in the UK and the World Health Organization's Pandemic Response Fund. So it's a good time, as ever, to get involved in Exponential View. So let's get started. First of all, my very special guest, Gideon Litchfield. Gideon, it's great to see you. Where are you today?
Today I am in my flat or apartment, depending on your location, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, down the road from MIT.
Yes, of course, the MIT Technology Review, which is one of my favorite magazines, but I think it's worth for the audience just to tell us a little bit about it and why it's so special.
All right. Well, MIT Technology Review likes to call itself the oldest technology magazine in the world. There's some dispute over that title, but it's been going for 120 years. And it was originally the alumni magazine of MIT. And about 3 or 4 decades ago, it also started selling subscriptions to people who were not alumni. So now our audience includes all of the MIT alumni around the world, plus several tens of thousands more who are just general readers interested in technology. And what we try to do is cover all of the emerging technologies, all of the things that are not, we don't write about iPhones and gadgets and so forth. We write about the things that are coming out of the research labs and out of the big company labs and the technologies that are going to change the way the world works.
Well, as I said, it's one of my favorites. It crosses over neatly, sits in between research papers and mainstream popular science and technology. So it just gives you that extra depth that makes it accessible. Now, I have a question for you. I mean, we've got to get this out of the way, but I understand Cambridge, Massachusetts was under lockdown and there was no access to barbers and hair care and styling. And I'm looking at you in my video and I'm thinking, your hair is not as wild as it should be.
Well, it was just very, very, very short a few weeks ago. So this is now growing back into what other people might consider a normal hairstyle. I consider it way too long. And I've, ordered some clippers online, and I might actually take them to my head later this week.
Now, I'm wondering, was your hair very short? Because as somebody who is at the heart of following this emerging epidemic, you had a sense that we might be going to social distancing and lockdown, and so had your barber?
No, it was just purely a fashion choice. Purely a fashion choice.
Well, it's working out in the lockdown. You guys have just at MIT Tech Review put together a fantastic new issue, which is really focusing on COVID-19 and what happens next. I'm curious, when did you start to think that COVID-19, or the novel coronavirus, as it was initially dubbed, was going to be something that was really going to matter?
I think, honestly, I was as late to understanding this as just about anybody. I think you, Azim, and some of your newsletters spotted where this was heading up probably a lot sooner than I did and than a lot of people did. I feel like it was a gradually increasing series of realizations that made it feel more and more important and more real. But I don't think that it really struck me personally until the day that I was in a supermarket and saw long lines and empty shelves and the people stocking up And I think this was right after the White House started to take it seriously. And I think before then it had always been there as an abstract idea that this could be something quite big, but it really hit home then.
Yeah, it hit home. So at the point at which you started to see the public response changing, right. I'm curious, as somebody who has been a journalist for a long time, on this one question, we could see that life was changing radically in other parts of the world. I mean, 100 million Chinese people were locked down and constrained to their domains and abodes, and serious things were happening in South Korea and in Singapore. Right. Why do you think that didn't translate over to us in the United Kingdom, United States, and elsewhere?
I think it's this thing again of just as for me it became real when I saw the empty shelves in the supermarket. I think these things become real for people when they affect them personally. And now in hindsight, it looks crazy that we looked at China and we looked at Italy and we didn't say exactly the same thing is going to happen here, and take measures earlier. But it becomes real for people when it affects them. Seems to be the same for politicians. And I think there was this kind of just magical thinking that surely this virus, which is spreading all over the world elsewhere, it's not going to have the same effect here. Why people thought that now doesn't seem plausible, because a virus operates by the same laws everywhere.
Yeah, we all have the same biology. We all have, in fact, the same biochemical machinery, which I think brings us neatly to some of the topics that you've looked at quite extensively. Let's take a look. You have a great op-ed editorial essay about what happens in over the next few months, and I just want to pull up a key phrase from it, which I'm now not going to be able to find, frustratingly, in my notes. Let me see if I
might even be able to quote it for you.
You might even be able to quote it. In a sense, what you say at the beginning of this this editorial is that we are putting too much hope on the idea that we get a vaccine for COVID-19, and that we may have to manage without one for quite some time. Why do you think that is?
Well, I don't think we're putting too much hope in the thought of getting one at all. It's just that a vaccine takes time. And even if you fast track all of the approvals and cut away all the red tape, simply the time it takes to develop a vaccine and then check that it works and that it really works for everybody, simply that's a period. And so the general consensus is we're looking at 12 to 18 months to get a vaccine, and we're probably looking at not less than 12 months to get a really effective treatment drug as well.
Right.
And it could be that some of the existing drugs that people are talking about these days, like these malaria pills that Donald Trump is very fond of, or an antiviral called remdesivir, there's a few drugs like that already exist that are being tested out. And if those do prove to be effective, then we could know a lot sooner. But unless we're really lucky with one of those, chances are we're waiting 12 to 18 months for an effective drug or a vaccine. And that just means,
yeah, but and is that the case even though we have seen an electrification in the pharmaceutical and biotech sectors with, I think you quote, more than 50 different therapies that treat people who have the condition, or vaccines that prevent us getting the disease? Do we really think that that's still going to take that amount of time?
I think all of these efforts, what they do is they increase the likelihood that we will get a successful drug or vaccine, but they don't necessarily shorten the time to take it. And there are some hurdles that can be skipped, and there are maybe some corners that can be cut. So instead of taking 2 or 3 years, it might take 18 months. But there's only so much that you can compress that timeline, because again, you have to test on a vaccine, you have to trial it with, I don't know how many I'm not an expert in vaccines, but you have to trial it with however many thousands of people for a long enough time to see that A, it works at preventing people from getting the disease, and B, that they stay immune for a long enough. Right? We also have to know how long this vaccine is effective, and if this is like the flu in that sense, it could be that vaccine only works for a few months and you have to renew it every year. Point is, however much effort you put into developing these things, there are still certain corners you cannot cut.
Right. So we can compress the time line so much. And when we hear 12 to 18 months, is that the presentation of a compressed timeline, or is that the traditional timeline and there is room to squeeze it down?
No, that's what people are saying now, is the fastest possible imaginable.
Fastest possible imaginable.
Now, who knows? Maybe things will change, but right now, that's just the consensus that's going around.
Okay, so let's talk about this 12 to 18 month period. There is a so we get this vaccine, and then you just mentioned something else that I think will make people feel a bit queasy, which is we don't know how long this vaccine will provide immunity for, because some vaccines we have at childhood and they sort of sort us out for life, and others like the seasonal flu only last for a few months. What are the factors, and how can we understand what they are when it comes to thinking what the longevity of this immunity will be?
So again, I'm not a virologist, I'm not an immunologist, and I think though that in general we still don't know very much about this for this particular virus. So you know, COVID is produced by a coronavirus. There are a bunch of other human coronaviruses. At least a couple of them are known to be flu-like in that you stay immune for less than a year. Others have a longer immunity period. So I think people just don't know yet what this virus is going to be like, and that's just unpredictable. So we don't know how long a vaccine will be effective, and we also don't know how long someone who has had the disease stays immune naturally. Right.
And then there are stories that are coming out today, in the last couple of days, that a whole bunch of people in South Korea who had the disease are now testing positive again. And the question is, does that mean there's short-lived immunity, or was it that the testing wasn't as reliable as we had hoped it would be? So there's just a lot that we don't know at the moment. I mean, every pair of binoculars, metaphorically, we pick up has got some jelly smeared on the front.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. That's a good metaphor.
Jelly smeared binoculars. If that shows up in your next issue, Gideon, I do want at least a congratulatory tweet. And just a reminder to our audience, which is numbering, I'm told, very, very significant numbers, sort of cruise ship levels, I understand. Please do put questions. If you're on the Crowdcast app, you can hit the Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen and put a question in a few minutes. We'll get to some of those great questions. If we are 18 months, I just want to say something about this. When we chatted about this call, you came across a little bit more pessimistic than me, and I was a little bit more optimistic. And I said, let's play this role. I'll be the optimist, you be the pessimist. But I want to say on vaccines, I want to play the pessimist, because I think 18 months is pretty bullish. If it's going to take 18 months, what are we going to do until then? I mean, you had your writers go out and you talked to experts across the United States, and you came back with a view. What are we going to do for 18 months?
All right. So there's been a couple of studies. There was one that was published a month ago by Imperial College. There was another one that just came out today in the journal Science.
Right.
And these are studies that are modeling, all right, if we don't have a vaccine or a drug, how do we do social distancing? How long do we have to do it for? How intensely do we have to do it while we're waiting for the cure or the vaccine to come along? And the results in both cases are kind of similar. You keep everybody locked up, or I mean, not locked up literally, but you keep people staying at home, not going to work, not going to public events, not going to public venues, keeping a distance as much as possible so that you can flatten the curve, so you can bring the number of cases down. And that takes about 2 to 3 months until you get them down to a low level. Remember in Wuhan in China, when they discovered that this thing was really spreading fast, and when they still only had a few hundred cases, they locked everybody down for, I think, about 2.5 months, and it was really, really strict. They shut public transport. They weren't letting people travel inside and out of the city. They weren't letting them leave their residential compounds, and they did that until, for some period of several days, they had no new infections. So that was the extreme version. And in the US, for instance, and I think this is true also in a lot of Europe, still taking the country down nearly as quickly as that. So let's assume it's going to take at least another couple of months before you bring the curve down to the level where infections are low. And then according to these modeling studies that we've seen, all right, if you start letting people back out again, then very quickly the level of infections rises again. So one of the proposals here is, all right, here's how we manage it. you lock everything down, you bring infections down, you start letting people back out, and then you monitor how many people are coming into hospitals or into ICUs.
Right.
And as soon as the number of people per day coming into an ICU goes above a certain level, you lock everybody down again.
Right.
And
an ICU is a sort of intensive care unit. We all know about them now. It's one nurse to patient, and there's all these monitors hooked up. We're all critical care experts today, courtesy of the internet. Why are ICU admissions the interesting thing to measure if you're thinking about releasing the pressure of a lockdown?
Right. Because basically the purpose of the lockdown is twofold. One is you want to try to minimize the number of people who get the disease and die. And the other is you want to keep your healthcare system from collapsing. So if you just let everybody catch the virus, as some people originally thought it might be a good idea to do, then according to these studies, you overwhelm, you maybe get 8 times or 10 times the capacity of the healthcare system in terms of new patients coming into the hospital. So the hospitals would collapse, and all the healthcare workers, the doctors, nurses would be traumatized. They're already being traumatized in some places.
Right.
So you have to keep it at a level that your healthcare system can cope with until they're secure. And that's why critical care or ICU admissions is sort of the benchmark.
Okay, fair enough. So that makes sense. So you have this this adaptive process where you monitor how much ICU admissions rise, and when they get above a certain level, you tell everyone to freeze. It's like a kid's game of musical statues, except we stop the economy and we reconfigure our daily routines and so on, and we freeze. When do we get to dance again?
So this is the question I think that's coming up now. If this is the scenario, if the only way to keep the virus from going out of control is to keep on opening up and then shutting down again, opening up and shutting down again, that's really not much better than just a total shutdown for a year and a half. Because a business can't survive if it can only be open every 1 month out of every 3 or 4.
And you don't know which month it is.
And you don't know which month it is, right? And even in the times when they're open, I think there would be a fear element. People would be afraid of catching the virus, so they wouldn't be going out as much anyway. They wouldn't be doing as much business. The unpredictability is impossible. So what we're seeing now is there's a bunch of new proposals that have been coming out over the last week or two, which are about how you can safely open up the economy and open up society again, even when there isn't a drug or a vaccine. And these proposals all rest on a handful of things. They rest on, number one, you've got to be doing massive testing of people. You want to be testing everybody in the country, ideally every few days.
Okay, hold on. Wait. Let's do some maths. 320 million people in the UK, in the US, in the United States, right? So you need to test them. Can we just say every 10 days? Because that's easier for my maths.
Well, actually, there are different ways of calculating this, which I can come to in a second.
Okay, fine. Okay, so testing one, right?
All right, so you have to be testing everybody often enough that if somebody gets the virus, you can catch it early before they've infected too many other people. Second, you need to be able to do contact tracing. This is something they've been doing in Singapore and in South Korea and in China and several other places. And what that means is every time somebody catches the virus and tests positive, you identify everybody they've closely interacted with over the previous, whatever it is, 7 days or 2 weeks. And you tell those people, all right, you've been exposed, go into quarantine. Or you've been exposed, go and get tested. And so by the combination of those two things, what you do is you catch any local outbreaks before they spread too far. And you selectively isolate the people who are at risk, and then you let other people out. So the idea would be people can circulate as long as they're being tested frequently. And then there's another thing that you can do, which is serology testing, which is testing for antibodies, in other words, for immunity. And that is, if you once you develop an antibody test, you can give it to people. And if somebody has already had the virus and they can show they're immune, and they get maybe a little certificate that says, I can't catch the virus anymore, and they are free to circulate as well. Now, there are some problems with all of these, but we can come to that in a second. But those are the basic building blocks. So massive testing for the virus, contact tracing with the people who have been in touch with someone who's infected, and serology testing to find out how widespread immunity is in general.
So it seems to me that there are a range of issues that we then have to overcome from all of these. So that the first is that are the scientific questions, like, do we have effective serology tests? Do we have a good mechanism, whether it's an app or something else, for contact tracing? And do we have the technology for widespread testing? Now, I think the answers are, in the order of those questions, are we don't have great serology tests right now. In the US and the UK, we don't have working contact tracing applications, nor do we necessarily have the human capital and the data resources to do contact tracing at large levels. I would note that once Singapore, which is brilliant at contact tracing, reached 1,000 cases, they had to shut the country down, because at 1,000 people, you couldn't contact trace anymore, because it's very, very intensive. And then the final area, which was general testing, which I guess is what they call this PCR DNA tests, PCR tests where you amplify the virus's RNA genetic code. We seem to know how to do those pretty well, and we also seem to know how to scale them up. So that feels like, well, of the hurdles to overcome, that's got the least science risk, as it were, but more a scaling risk attached to it.
Well, so there's a question here about whether those are the best method. I mean, there are other tests being developed that don't necessarily require you to take and amplify the RNA from the virus. So they're not PCR tests, there are other kinds. Those are all still being worked on. But I think the problem with the point is, to scale the tests we have right now from, I mean, in the US, they're doing 150,000 tests a day or so at the moment. To do the kind of testing that we're talking about, you would need to be doing millions of tests.
Every day.
And the range varies. It depends a little bit on how targeted you can be in your testing. If you can use data on, if you can use contact tracing and you can use other data to tell you where the infected people are most likely to be, you can make the testing more targeted. And then you might only need 2.5 or 3 million tests a day in the US. If you just have to test everybody at random, you're talking tens of millions of tests a day. So either way, it's way, way more than is happening at the moment.
Right.
And the PCR tests that we have right now are also not that reliable. There's something like I think 20%, 25% false negative rate. And that's simply because swabbing somebody, you have to stick the swab into their nostrils and then down the back of their throat. And that swabbing process just isn't very reliable.
I hope they do the swab the other way, which is the throat first and then the nostril, because or not. I don't know. What do we think?
I have not been swabbed, so
I'm trying to inject some levity into this sort of horrible situation we find ourselves in. You've said something else I think that's interesting, because I talked about the science and the engineering challenges to this three-pronged approach, which was massive testing, serology testing, and contact tracing. There are also institutional and kind of legal issues. In particular, couple of dimensions. One is that, as you point out, having localized knowledge of where these outbreaks are becomes really, really important. And if you can clamp down on those outbreaks at a local level, the finer grained your clamping down shears are, the fewer people who don't need to be caught by it get caught by it. So if the only tool you have is a national lockdown, which is what we have in the UK, you have to shut everything down. But if you can shut down a single city or a single suburb or a single sub-district of a suburb, you can actually let many more people go about their daily lives. I mean, how do you think about that problem?
I think I find it hard to imagine the US completely shutting down a single district, for instance, or a single town or a village. I think that the way this might be effective is not so much about trying to lock down a particular geographical area. It's, if you are doing the testing effectively enough and the contact tracing effectively enough, then you can keep on basically chasing every single outbreak to wherever it spreads and isolating those people. But as you said, in the case of Singapore, I think that only works if the general level of infections is relatively low. So, if only a handful of new infections are appearing every day in a particular state, let's say, then, when somebody is infected, you trace all of their contacts, you isolate all of those people. Hopefully you've managed to catch it before it spread out beyond that group.
Mm.
But that only works if you have first flattened the curve down to the point where infections are at a really low level. I think a lot of this, I mean, exactly how well this works really does depend on, on the numbers. It's sort of a numbers game of trying to beat the virus. How many tests can you do? How effective is your contact tracing? How good are people about adhering to quarantine? Or how do you enforce that? At the moment, we don't, if somebody is told to quarantine here in the US right now, it's self-enforced. Right. Nobody's calling up to make sure that they're really staying at home and not talking to people. So how effective is the enforcement? How quick and immediate is the response from local authorities? All of these numbers play into how well this works.
I think, as you and I have discussed previously, the two countries that I think are really interesting to look at and not spoken about so much are Vietnam and Taiwan, both of whom are very close to China and should by all rights be overridden by COVID-19, but have done a great job.
So actually, I don't know about Vietnam. What happened in Vietnam?
Well, what happened in Vietnam was that very early on, they shut down their schools. So before Lunar New Year, and they also started to look for imported cases at the airports. And essentially, if you came from a hot zone country, which was, as it happened at one stage, the United States or China or other places, you would be put into a quarantine queue at the airport. And you might spend 4 or 5 hours before you get very, very extensively screened. Right. And then you'd have to quarantine for 2 weeks. And they did that very early on, well before you get to the stage that you've got to in the United Kingdom, the United States, where actually all of this is happening internally now. It's not imported cases. But I think for people who are watching this, there is a good article on what Taiwan did and what it continues to do on a website called JAMA Network, JAMA Network. And if you just Google Taiwan coronavirus,
Taiwan or Vietnam?
Taiwan. Vietnam is actually, I can't remember the URL, I'm afraid. So.
Okay. All right. I mean, another good example is Kerala in India.
So, right. Oh, yes. You guys wrote about that. What happened in Kerala?
So Kerala is a bit of an exceptional case in India as a state. It's got a different history, has a very high literacy rate, education rate, strong institutions. But what they did was they very early on instituted a contact tracing program, and it was manual. It wasn't like an app like they have in Singapore, for instance. We can talk more about that later. It was literally, they learned about a family that had tested positive for the virus. And then this family actually didn't really want to cooperate with the authorities. So they used a mixture of surveillance camera footage and interviews, and they traced their cell phone locations and basically retraced this family's route through the state in the previous 7 days, figured out all the places they'd been, put out massive calls on social media and asked people who'd been in touch with that family to identify themselves. And then all of those people were told to go into isolation. And the state government had people on the phone calling them every single day and asking them questions to make sure that they were observing the quarantine. And then as they continued to trace more cases and do more testing, they gradually increased the number of people who were observing quarantine and were being monitored in some form. And I think at the last count, they had like hundreds of thousands of people doing quarantine this way. Now, again, it was only possible because they were willing to devote the resources to it. It was quite labor intensive, but also because they started it really early.
Yeah. Well, and so I think there's something more. It's also about the nature of the social contract and the nature of trust that you have in a society and the kind of cultural underpinnings of a particular nation. I mean, I think the US with its its founding story being about telling a king, you can't tell me what to do. That wonderful individuality that creates enterprise creates a challenge in a moment where you need to ask people to all behave in a particular way. Now, one way of doing this is to use the technology. You actually have a wonderful article by one of my favorite AI researchers, Genevieve Bell, in your special issue on coronavirus, where she essentially raises the challenge of how can you create a panopticon, an all-seeing technology that actually works in our favor and in our interest rather than against them in the long term.
Yeah.
What did you think of her argument?
I mean, her argument's a sort of broad philosophical one almost. It's not so much about the details of how you do it. But what she says is, the technology of surveillance as we know it is oriented around essentially around finding criminals, right? And it's about it's about tracing people who have committed some sort of crime or infraction and trying to hunt down those individuals. And then she also says, historically, contact tracing, as it was understood in the past, was associated with disease control, epidemic control, in cases where there was also a kind of a moral dimension. So it's associated with the AIDS crisis, associated with the spread of venereal disease in World War II. So there's a kind of morally disapproving aspect to it. And she says, what we need to do is, number one, think about how we use data in such a way where it's not about tracking down an individual who needs to be punished, but about making individuals safer and helping society be safer. And then number two, you have to get rid of that sort of moral dimension that's associated with this kind of tracing and surveillance, where it's seen as something that means you did something bad, and is really, again, it's about protecting society as a whole. And then you have to also have new ideas about how data privacy is engineered there. How you need new ways of doing safeguards on how people's data is used and who it's shared with and how soon it's deleted. So a lot of the kinds of debates that are happening in Europe around data protection sort of now need to play into this broader question of how we do public health data.
It's quite an important question, because the way that the article in MIT Tech Review phrases it is quite important. It is turning around the question of the panopticon, I think, in a way that's really helpful. And a lot of this depends on there being the right framework of rights for the individual, many of which only exist if you've actually thought through this problem theoretically. So I had a conversation today with the president of Estonia, which you'll be able to listen to in a few days. And her point was that we can do many of these things because over the last 10 years, we have increased citizens' rights with respect to how the state can use this data for their benefit.
Right.
And I guess one of the things that I am concerned with is that in their rush to bring out contact tracing applications, will governments who have never historically built the best apps in the world anyway really pause to give thought to Genevieve's arguments? What do you think?
Yeah, it's hard to believe they will. I think one of the questions is exactly how this comes about. So in the US, for instance, there's a bunch of different efforts now already to build contact tracing apps of one kind or another. And I don't even have a good handle on how many different ones there are. But some of these are coming from, universities, some are coming from the private sector. And I think there's still some wiggle room here for just how much government dictates the way that these work versus adopts things that have already been built. So I can imagine, just about imagine, a situation whereby somebody comes up with something that is actually designed to protect people's privacy, and then that becomes adopted as a standard or by the governments, and then we end up with something that is not too terrible. Now the problem is, again, since there's nobody really guiding this process and nobody's creating guidelines for it, it's a bit of a crapshoot which one will end up with.
So there's no kind of top-down direction in the US, and in general there's no global coordination. And we've now got 22 questions. If you do want to ask a question, put it into the ask a question button. We will get to them, but I do have a couple of things I wanted to touch off with Gideon.
Before you do that, I'm going to get a charger for my laptop. One second.
Okay. In which case I will extemporize for a couple of minutes to the few hundred of us who are here. One of the things that I am...
Sorry about that. Should have been plugged in before.
That's great. One of the things that I am optimistic about is the way that the bottom-up response of science and engineering has just been galvanized. And we are seeing exponential growth in the number of academic papers touching on the different aspects of this pandemic, from the kind of public health aspects to the virology, the genomics, the treatment protocols. In fact, 5,000 papers published on the coronavirus since January the 21st, as of sort of some point earlier today. That's pretty remarkable. We're collaborating quicker than ever before. How do you see that? As someone, when we first met, you were a science correspondent at the Economist, and science didn't move that quickly, nor did it have the public presence that it currently has on our TV channels and social media feeds. Is this something that we can take some long-term comfort from?
Maybe. I mean, I think all of the collaboration is really encouraging. The speed with which information is getting out is really encouraging. The things to worry about are, number one, people are rushing stuff out without it being, peer reviewed and checked in the normal ways. And maybe at this stage, that doesn't matter too much, because it's more about getting numbers out there. But I think one of the side effects of it also is that, we're seeing some very contradictory results. For instance, there are many conflicting studies about just how contagious the virus is, or what proportion of people are asymptomatic. And so I think what we're seeing play out in the public eye is the process by which science works. People come up with differing results. They build off each other's research. Gradually, there's a convergence, and then you end up with something that is kind of a consensus. What we're seeing is that consensus building happening in real time. And the problem is, I think that maybe a lot of people don't really understand that that's how it works. So people in the public are tending to cherry pick scientific results that suit their narrative and go, oh, look, science said this, so it must be true. And that is, I think, helping feed into some of this, the politicization of this pandemic. So, I'll give you an example. I mean, this was not. There was an article by a prominent epidemiologist about a month ago saying, we don't yet know, and he was right. He said, we don't yet know how widespread this actually is. We don't know if maybe half the population has already got it and they just never showed symptoms, and maybe it's actually no more deadly than the flu. And that was definitely a possibility given the lack of data we have. But it wasn't a fact. It was an idea, that's something, a hypothesis to be tested. And because this is all in the public eye, I think a lot of politicians, particularly on the right in the US, seized on that kind of statement and said, yeah, we're closing the economy down way too fast. We're being way too scared. We're probably way overreacting. And that it's hard when that kind of narrative gets going, and then you can't really stop it.
Yeah, well, it's good point. I mean, it is a really good point. We are exposing people to the sausage making process that is science, and people like the sausages. They may not like how it's made, or indeed understand how it's made. One of the key aspects that I think is misunderstood at times of uncertainty like this is the statistical concept of the fat-tailed risk, and this idea that hidden somewhere is something that you can't necessarily evaluate its scale, but it could be huge. And we can't evaluate its scale because we haven't run lots of experiments of unleashing coronavirus in different controlled conditions through large populations. And when you have a big tail risk like that, you have to take a precautionary approach to it.
Right.
That is one aspect of the science that hasn't made it to as well as it might to the mainstream press. There's Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who wrote the book The Black Swan, has done his best on Twitter to get people to pay attention to this tail risk. I'm not sure if they necessarily are, but I'm curious about this moment, which is, I can't remember a time when science was as important as this. But the last times when it might have been, at least in American history, were during the Apollo project and during the Manhattan Project in World War II.
Right.
And each of those had a very, very clear goal, a goal that anyone working in business will remember: smart, specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic and time-bound. We will put a man on the moon and return him safely by the end of the decade. I mean, that's a great, smart goal. But it was top-down and directed, and there was a vision that was constructed for that and the Manhattan Project. in this world of decentralized collaboration and open source and Linux and all the wonderful things the internet has brought us, do you think we need that kind of directed, visionary, guiding hand to orient all these efforts, or can these bottom-up efforts get us there without a kind of emotional and intellectual leadership from, a president or head of state?
I think it would definitely be better if there were leadership from the top, because yes, I think you can have a hybrid, if you like, of this bottom-up ethos, which is something much newer, and that can help find solutions in a way maybe much faster. But in order to find solutions, you have to have a clear statement of the problem. Now, we're already seeing this kind of grassroots organizing happening around all sorts of things. So you've seen it, grassroots efforts come together around creating masks and personal protective equipment for hospitals. There's a whole bunch of different initiatives on trying to use AI to, test different molecules to see whether they're promising drug candidates for coronavirus. So there's a lot of this stuff, but it's chaotic and it's uncoordinated. And I think over time, coordination will emerge naturally, but you could shortcut that process and get to the end faster if you actually had clear guidelines, clear leadership from the top saying, all right, these are the things we need. These are our national priorities on fixing coronavirus. So, and then inviting people into solving those specific problems. And I think the other thing is you need to know if you're going to invest in, whether it's researching a drug or finding some kind of technology for contact tracing, whatever, you need to know that there is going to be demand for it, that someone is going to use it. And again, if all you're doing is throwing stuff out into the dark and hoping that it sticks, I think the chances of something, it will just take longer for something successful to emerge.
Yeah, and so that's why it's quite helpful doing what Bill Gates has done, which is he's essentially gone off and said, I will take the financial risk for a number of pretty expensive vaccine trials and developments running into the billions of dollars.
Right.
It's also the kind of thing that governments could do and say, in a sense, regardless of success, we're going to co-fund, underwrite, and we guarantee to buy at the end of the process, X billion dollars worth of vaccines. We've had 25 questions, which is absolutely positively phenomenal. Please keep putting your questions into Ask a Question. There is one, I think it's really worth us tackling this question, because we often talk about the US and the UK and the Western and richer parts of the world. Sarah asks this question. I'm from a developing country where the economy was bad even before COVID, and I'm asking myself how we're going to manage afterwards. So, what do we know thus far about how COVID is hitting poorer parts of the world?
I mean, as you pointed out, there are some countries like Vietnam that have been handling it relatively well. Though, of course, I think handling it well right now in the early stages is no guarantee that will continue, because if it nonetheless spreads and gets out of control, then it might those early measures might not carry you through. I think we still don't know, because particularly in the poorer countries, generally there isn't as much testing anyway, so we have no idea of, even less idea of how widespread the virus is. What we can certainly expect is that in a lot of countries that have got big cities and big slums and so forth, doing social distancing and doing basic hygiene is really hard. And so the hopes of flattening the curve effectively there are going to are much more limited. Plus, they don't have nearly as many hospital facilities, ICUs, ventilators. So what I expect, unfortunately, is, fairly epic disasters in a lot of those countries. And maybe the one thing that they have going in their favor is, first of all, in a lot of those countries, the population is younger on average, and we know that younger people are less affected by the virus. So maybe the general rate of serious illness and death is going to be much lower. And then, these are countries that sadly have also got lots of experience of dealing with pandemics of their own. And I think there's maybe certain inbuilt social mechanisms of resilience that allow them to weather this kind of thing better than a rich country, which is where people are absolutely terrified of anything that increases their risk of death.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I spoke with a former general, a former four-star general in the British Armed Forces a year or so ago. We were talking about resilience and citizen resilience, and he described, he said, the problem with people in the West is they're strategic snowflakes and have become so accustomed to niceties that they don't have the resilience if a shock emerges. And so perhaps
Sounds like the kind of thing an army general would say, but
well,
yeah.
he's pretty tough, yeah. But I mean, perhaps there is some hope in the sense that uh, populations are younger. People are incredibly inventive when they have resource constraints.
Right.
Some of the discussions that are going on in the United States, the United Kingdom, should we wear masks? Should we even wrap a scarf around our face? Might just not be an issue in those other markets. They'll just go ahead and do it in the hope that it will work. But like you, I'm not optimistic. I'm not optimistic about the short-term impact and indeed the financial and economic impact, because ultimately somebody needs to be able to loan those nations money, and we need to have certainty that those loans will get put to good and productive use.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's look at another question that's people are finding quite popular. Is the real secret, asks Phil, that a lot more people need to get the virus and therefore immunity, while the most vulnerable, mostly older people, stay locked down and protected, waiting for the vaccine?
So this is a common belief. So for a while in Britain, there was this policy that they should lock down only, as you say, but keep the people who are particularly vulnerable isolated and let the virus spread through the rest of the population unchecked. And the problem with this is that even if you do that, you still end up with a surge of patients that is many more times than the healthcare system can handle, at least based on what we know about the virus so far. So you still run into that same problem. You collapse your healthcare system before you get to a cure or to herd immunity.
Hey, Gideon, you've lost your video.
All right, that's a bit strange.
Yeah.
Can you see me now?
All we see is a very fetching-looking pixelated alien, like that's escaped from a 1980s version of Space Invaders. While we wait for your video to return, which I'm sure it will, we will continue with the questions. So your point about herd immunity being that on the way to getting it, you collapse the healthcare system, and that way lies terrible outcomes. Okay, right. So members of the audience are saying they can still see you. So obviously the system was just hiding you from me. All right, sorry about that. Thank you, Tina and Gaurav and Daniel and Carol and David and TJ and Jeff and David again for telling me that. My mistake. I'm a newbie to all of this. There's another question which I think is we should chat about, which is this one. I'm going to pose it in some context. So a couple of days ago, Apple and Google came out and said, we're going to create this API, which is a way of, accessing systems within their phones, their phone operating systems, which represent 99% of the market share of smartphones, to enable privacy by design contact tracing. So contact tracing that in some sense respects my privacy and can't be used for scary police surveillance type of processes. So a couple of questions for you. From what they've put out so far, do we think that is an important and viable path? And the second question is, what additional checks and balances do we need to put into place? And when I think about those checks and balances, I think not only of unexpected ongoing uses of those APIs as they turn from something we implemented for the pandemic, but just something that's in the phone, number one. And number two, at the end of the day, Apple and Google are duopolists in this market. And so one often takes a free cookie from a duopolist with some care. So maybe you could just tackle those two angles.
Sure. Well, maybe I should start by saying I think a lot of people are spooked out a bit by the idea of contact tracing because they feel like it's this idea that you're then being tracked and your movements are being tracked. And I think it's important to say that it doesn't have to be like that. There are there are lots of different proposals, and there are also lots of different existing implementations of contact tracing using people's phones. But some of them are actually very good at preserving privacy. And I'll just give an example of what that means. In what's called peer-to-peer tracking, which is part of the kind of thing that Apple and Google are talking about doing. The idea is that if you have your phone and you have this app on it, anytime you're near somebody else whose phone has the same app and you spend more than a few minutes near them, your two phones swap these encrypted tokens by Bluetooth. And the token is simply like a record that this phone was near your phone.
Right.
It doesn't contain your location. It doesn't contain your identity.
Right.
It's just a register of that phone. And the idea is that if you then subsequently test positive for the virus and you put that result into this app, then everybody else whose phone picked up a token from your phone gets a notification that they have been near somebody who was infected.
Right.
But it doesn't tell them who that person is. It doesn't tell them where that person was. And that you can implement this in such a way that that data isn't even stored centrally anywhere. So it can be a very good privacy preserving way of letting people know that they've been exposed without actually giving away any identifying data of the person who is infected. So that's the ideal of contact tracing. What Google and Apple have done, it's a little bit unclear yet how this will all work. So that what they've created is basically the structure, the underlying structure, if you like, that allows Android and iOS phones to exchange data, to exchange these Bluetooth tokens. Somebody else still has to go and build the apps that you would download that then actually do the tracing and the notification. And there are different ways those apps could be made. So a healthcare authority or a government could build an app that says anytime someone's infected, the government gets a notification, and then it goes and follows up with other people to make sure that they're doing isolation. Or it could build an app that doesn't route the information through the government, but just directly from one user to another. So I think the discussion that we have to have really is about what sort of data collection, what sort of app design for this is going to be acceptable, and who's going to do it. And then, as you say, what's going to happen with the data afterwards? And I think that's, nobody is leading that discussion. I think lots of people are talking about it. Lots of people in the research community and in policy think tanks and so forth are talking about what's the right way to do this. But it's all still a bit of a cacophony. But what I do see, again, maybe to be a bit optimistic here, is I do see more and more convergence on some of these ideas. So I can see a consensus starting to emerge on what's the right way to do it. And then it will come down to whether or not the authorities, particularly in the US, actually heed that advice.
Well, historically, at moments like this, the states have used emergencies as an opportunity to increase their powers, not decrease them. Yes. I wrote about this in one of my essays, The Three Cleavages, which you can find at exponentialview.co. And you saw that after 9/11 with the Patriot Act and what the new powers that created. You also saw it after the Depression with the expansion of the state. So when I look at this, you think, well, based on the run of history, you would expect that anything we implement around that becomes sort of state mandated around contact tracing will stay around with us for either reasons of good reasons that are benign or reasons that encroach on our civil liberties for decades to come.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that it will, and again, that could be benevolent or it could be not. I think that if we're going to be prepared for the next pandemic, which eventually will happen, we need to have these systems in place so that next time it doesn't shut down the entire world economy, but we can catch it in time. If the entire world had a system like Singapore's or South Korea's or wherever, and had been able to react in time to coronavirus, we might not be having these conversations. Yeah. So I think it's important that this stuff does continue. That's why we have to set it up right today.
Yes. No, I think that's an important observation. I guess the question is, what's the flavor under which it ends up continuing, and what can we do in the UK, in my case, and in the US for you and your readers to influence that direction so that it serves us rather than being a tool for controlling us.
Well, I think people need to be well informed about what the different possibilities are, so that they can in whatever way they like. I don't know, put pressure on politicians to choose the option that doesn't end up just sacrificing privacy forever.
Well, one of our viewers, Helen E, has just made a really great contribution. She said that she was fascinated to see Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote that book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, essentially attacking the business models of Google and Facebook for monetizing human intent. And she has really mounted a staunch attack on surveillance, saying that pandemic tracking apps should be mandatory like vaccines, with the obvious caveat that they're not for profit and data used for the benefit of all. Which is a pretty interesting idea.
I thought it was really interesting that Shoshana Zuboff came out and said that. And I feel like I've seen similar sentiments from other people who are, big champions of privacy. So I think, again, this is taking the optimistic point of view, but I think there are people like her who see this as an opportunity to maybe correct some of the ways in which we've used data in the past, because we've gradually allowed this encroachment of data collection and tracking on us, mainly for commercial purposes, though also for government, for law enforcement purposes, and we haven't done too much to resist it. Here now, because there is this real need for it, but for a public health purpose, for something that actually benefits everybody, there's possibly an opportunity to shift the balance in the right way, to create contact tracing and other kinds of tracking in a form that is actually benevolent, and let that be the template for future uses. So I think maybe that's why somebody like Shoshana Zuboff is welcoming it, because there is this potential.
Let's go to another big issue, actually, that we didn't get a chance to tackle. And one viewer has asked this, Ergina Restu. I'll read you out her question and we can broaden your response, which is, do you think the changes we now see in the environment may make people realize the impact our way of living has on the planet and make them more environmentally conscious? And I'll put the miserable version of that question to you, which is, how much damage will the response to coronavirus and the sort of political fracas that comes out of it do to overall climate change policy?
Well, so unfortunately, the damage that it does could be considerable, and that's for a couple of reasons. Well, one thing is that the benefit that it's doing to climate change is much less than you might think. So there were some figures out recently that even though the U.S. economy is collapsing, looking at possibly 50% decline by the second or third quarter, I forget what figures. Anyway, the total emissions for the year are expected to only go down by 4%. And what that tells us is that, in some sense, the economy is already relatively, it's the kinds of things that we're doing in order to keep the economy going that are actually producing the bulk of the emissions already. So what that means is that in order to really reduce emissions, we have to very fundamentally restructure a lot of the things that underlie the economy today. Simply, in other words, simply freezing things for a bit doesn't actually buy you that much in terms of reduced emissions.
So, which I think go ahead. Go ahead. No.
Well, anyway, so then the longer term impact on climate change is, I think, twofold. Number one, we're going to see a lot less investment in clean energy technologies, just because there's a lot less investment in everything going to happen right now, and also because oil prices are low at the moment, so there's less incentive to invest in clean energy, and there's also less incentive to for things like carbon credits and carbon taxes. So overall, the money that could go into pushing clean energy forward and general structural change forward is going to be less. And B, because of COVID, I think we're probably going to see a lot more of an acceleration of a tendency we've seen in the last few years, which is to a kind of technological nationalism, with countries closing off their borders, hoarding resources, trying to protect technologies that they think give them a competitive advantage, increasing trade wars and so forth. That nationalist tendency is, I think, going to get accelerated by COVID, because now everyone's going to be trying to protect themselves against people from other countries and hoarding the drug supplies for themselves or the equipment supplies for themselves. And that increasing nationalism is precisely what you don't want when you're trying to negotiate a global agreement on climate. So it harms the possibility for global cooperation.
Okay, wow. So that is Thanks. You've made me feel doubly miserable with that response, Gideon. But you've touched on a couple of underlying themes, which I think we'll get to. We're at the top of the hour, and I think if we can, are you good to run for another 10 minutes, perhaps?
Yes.
Yep. So before we get to those themes, which is about what happens next, we haven't talked about this question of the immunity passport. So the immunity passport is this idea that is being explored by a number of governments that once you can demonstrate that you're not actively infectious, so perhaps you've never had this disease or you've got antibodies to it, you could go about your everyday life. And in a sense, they have some sort of smartphone-based immunity passport in some parts of China right now, sort of a green code that you get. Do you think that what do you think we would need to have in place, both from a medical, a technical, and a legal or institutional basis for immunity passports? And is there any real possibility that we'll end up carrying these things around, or is this just more blogger whiffle?
I do think it's quite possible that we will. So what would we need? First of all, we need good immunology tests, serology tests. And at the moment, we don't have them. There was this fiasco in the UK where the UK government ordered millions of tests for people to use at home and then discovered they just weren't good enough.
Right.
There's some stuff that we probably don't need to go into, but at the moment, the tests are such that they return a pretty high rate of false positives, most of them.
Right.
So maybe it might be 2%, it might be 5%. And it turns out that when you do the maths, what that means is that actually quite a large number of people who take a test and get a positive result, meaning it shows that they're immune to coronavirus, are actually not immune to coronavirus. They're immune to something else that showed up as a coronavirus in that test. If you let those people back out into the community, when they think they're positive, think they're immune, but they're not, then you have another public health disaster. So the tests need to get way more accurate before you can safely use them on people in that way.
Right.
So then you need, then you need, well, what do you need after that? You need some sort of protocol for carrying out the tests, making sure that the results have been verified and that they're entered into some sort of database that everybody is using, that's agreed on. Maybe that's not that difficult to do. Maybe part of the way that comes about is that you require a test in order to, say, go back to work. Your employer administers an immunity test, or to go into certain places, or even to travel on public transport. Who knows? But the point is, you could by creating restrictions that say only people who are immune are allowed to do certain things, you create the demand for the tests, and you start creating an infrastructure for carrying them out. So then you need some sort of national database, presumably, of immunity. And you need a verification system that everybody can use, whether that's a smartphone app or some sort of scanner or whatever, or even a document. But I can see it coming about. But I think the main obstacle is actually just good, reliable tests.
So let's wrap on where this actually goes in a kind of big picture dimension. I'm going to pick up on the immunity passport. So you can imagine in a few years, we carry immunity passports around. We have mandatory contact tracing apps, like we have mandatory vaccinations. We're not traveling abroad as much to other countries, are we? Because no one wants to talk to each other because of this economic nationalism. But more seriously, of these trends that have been swirling for the last 5 to 7 years of artificial intelligence and robotics and genomic technologies, it seems like coronavirus accelerates more of them in the same direction that they were already traveling than it knocks them akimbo and sends them into a different direction or stops them entirely. Is that your sense, that in broadly speaking, it is bringing the future from that we saw 5 years out closer to us more quickly?
Look, I think just about any major disruption, whether it's an economic shock or a virus or something like that, there are always opportunities in it for people. And I think for any technology that's sufficiently general purpose, there are always opportunities to use that technology to solve problems associated with the disruption. So certainly in the case of AI and robotics, I think you're seeing more use of AI in simple things like diagnostic testing, and drug development. That was already happening, and people are starting to apply that to coronavirus. You're going to probably see more use of AI in everything from doing, triaging patients at a hospital to identifying hotspots where you need to do testing, to then starting to take more and more decisions that might have been human and automate more of them. Maybe we'll see more telemedicine. We'll see more use of robots in hospitals. We'll see more use of robots in workplaces and in factories. Maybe the way that you have an office in the future, if you can't immediately go back to work, is that you've got one of those telepresence robots that's scooting around and you control it remotely, so you can go and meet with your colleagues. People will see those opportunities and they'll exploit them. So yeah, I think we will see more and more of that starting to happen. And then it's a question of just how much do we revert back to the previous norm after the pandemic is over. And some things I think will revert. I'm not actually that optimistic about the travel thing. I think after being cooped up for so long, everybody will go on a travel binge as soon as we can.
I'm going to throw out the contrary view on travel because here's what I think is going to happen with travel. The airlines have furloughed their staff. They've mothballed their airplanes, and the airports are shut. And this stuff is just going to take ages to kind of come back up to life. It just takes time to find where the staff are, get the planes running, and in most parts of the world, which will come out of this early, will be in the northern hemisphere, and so it'll be winter in the northern hemisphere, and the southern hemisphere countries will be still going through their wave, because we talked earlier about how the developing world has got this sort of disaster waiting for them. So there won't be any nice warm destinations for Americans to fly to come November when the airlines are operating again. And so their choice will be to fly to Detroit or Des Moines or Banff in Canada. And I just don't see 50 million people going off and doing that in November.
Well, maybe not in November, and especially because I think it's quite possible that we end up with a second wave of the pandemic in the winter, and then that will be shut down again. But after we've got a vaccine, year and a half from now, I mean, sure, it'll take time to take the planes out of mothballs, but I think people will want to travel as much as they can.
Gideon, we've got to that point where I can only think of silly things to say. And one thing I wanted to ask you is, when can I get a drone-based barber to come and look after this kind of craziness that's happening on my head? Have you got a prediction?
I don't know, but when you find one, let me know, because I'm going to need it too.
It's been fantastic having you on. I guess we call this a show. You have so many interesting insights. I mean, I think the magazine is fantastic. Can I do a plug? The magazine will be online tomorrow on technologyreview.com. Of course you can, technologyreview.com. And also your Twitter handle is quite fun to follow. Do you want to share that with people?
That is just G Litchfield, G-L-I-C-H Field.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you to the many of you who have joined us today. Just a reminder that if you click the green button, you can get subscription to Exponential View on a special rate, and 35% of all of our revenue from annual subscriptions that we get this month will go to various coronavirus initiatives. Thanks for taking the time today, and stay safe, wash your hands, and keep your distance.
And don't touch your face. Thank you. Bye, Azim.
Bye-bye.